The university basement was off-limits because within its dust-choked walls, a truth was interred, a secret so profoundly disruptive that men of power had conspired to bury not just evidence, but the very man who unearthed it. For decades, the sprawling campus of Blackwood University had hummed with the predictable cadence of academic life. Gothic spires reached for the sky, libraries groaned under the weight of forgotten knowledge, and beneath it all, a labyrinth of sub-basements lay, ignored and largely inaccessible. Most were storage, utility tunnels, or archives deemed too obscure even for the most dedicated researchers. But one section, beneath the oldest wing of the classics department, was different. It was sealed. A rusted iron gate, padlocked shut, bore a faded sign: restricted access, structural instability. This was a lie. The instability wasn't in the foundations of the building, but in the foundations of accepted history, a tremor capable of bringing down entire academic reputations. The story begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, a persistent, almost ethereal hum that had bothered Dr. Eleanor Vance since her appointment as the university's new archivist. Her predecessor, a man of methodical but uninspired habits, had left behind a trove of disorganized documents, and among them, a series of cryptic, half-burned journals. These weren't official university records, they were personal, filled with dense, almost frantic handwriting, interspersed with sketches of unfamiliar symbols and calculations that seemed to defy known mathematics. The name scrawled on the inside cover, barely legible, was Professor Alastair Finch, a name she'd never heard in all her studies of Blackwood's long history. Alastair Finch, it turned out, was an academic ghost. He had been a brilliant, if notoriously reclusive professor of ancient languages during the interwar period. His tenure, according to university records, had been brief and unremarkable, ending with his sudden departure in 1937, officially attributed to ill health. The few colleagues who remembered him spoke of an obsessive man, brilliant but unstable, who eventually cracked under the pressure of his own eccentric theories. But the journals painted a different picture. They spoke of discovery, of a burgeoning excitement that pulsed through his archaic script, a sense of being on the precipice of something monumental. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease as she pieced together fragments from the tattered pages. Finch wasn't just studying old texts, he was hunting for something within them, a hidden pattern, a code that suggested a global interconnectedness of ancient cultures far predating any accepted timeline. His sketches resembled geological formations, astronomical charts, and then, disturbingly, intricate mechanical diagrams that seemed impossible for any civilization prior to the Industrial Revolution. What kind of ill health would cause a man to abandon such groundbreaking work? And why was there no trace of his research papers, no formal publications from his time at Blackwood? It was as if his entire academic existence had been meticulously erased. The journals eventually led her to a specific section of the university's microfiche archives, cross-referencing obscure property deeds from the early 20th century. There, buried within bureaucratic boilerplate, was a single hand-drawn map of the original Blackwood campus grounds, dating to its founding in the late 1800s. And on that map, underneath the classics department, was a small, unlabeled square, annotated in a familiar, frantic hand. Sub-basement access, blocked 1937, the very year Alastair Finch vanished. A cold certainty settled over Eleanor. This wasn't just a secret in the basement, this was a conspiracy. What compelled men to bury truth so deeply? Was it fear of the unknown, or something far more mundane, like protecting their own intellectual empires?
The university had, in 1937, been a bastion of traditional scholarship. Finch's theories, if proven, would have shattered entire fields of study, rewritten textbooks, and quite possibly ended careers. The stakes for the academic elite were not just intellectual, but financial and personal. They stood to lose everything. Eleanor's search began subtly with innocent-sounding requests to the facilities department about historical building plans, plumbing schematics. She learned the sealed-off basement section had once been an experimental laboratory, a forgotten corner where early, pioneering electrical engineering research had taken place before the department moved to a dedicated building. This detail, though seemingly unrelated, gnawed at her. Why would a linguist like Finch be interested in an old electrical lab? Unless his ancient technology was more than just a theory. She noticed the janitorial staff avoided that particular corridor. When pressed, the oldest among them, a taciturn man named Silas, who had been with Blackwood for 40 years, would only mutter about unsettling drafts and things best left alone. The air around Eleanor thickened with a sense of impending revelation. She found herself drawn to the old classics department building at odd hours, the quiet of the night amplifying the creaks and groans of the old structure. The locked gate became a magnet. She imagined Finch, a man obsessed, descending into those depths, perhaps in the dead of night, driven by an unyielding hunger for knowledge, a hunger that clearly led him to an unspeakable end. The question wasn't just what he found, but what found him. After weeks of fruitless official channels, Eleanor decided a more direct approach was necessary. She borrowed a set of master keys, a bold and frankly unprofessional move that went against every rule she swore by. The metallic clang of the old iron gate as it finally swung open echoed ominously in the silent corridor. The air that greeted her was not merely cold, but utterly stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying paper, and something else. Something metallic and faintly acrid, like old electricity or rusted machinery. Her flashlight beam cut through the thick dust motes dancing in the air, revealing a narrow, descending staircase. Each step creaked under her weight, a prelude to a secret that had festered for nearly a century. What would you have done in her shoes, standing on the precipice of a forbidden truth, knowing the risks she was taking with her career, perhaps even her safety? If you've ever felt that pull of a mystery, that insatiable need to uncover what's hidden, then you understand the compulsion that drove Eleanor forward. The staircase opened into a vast, cavernous space, far larger than she had anticipated. It was indeed an old laboratory, but one frozen in time. Tables were laden with rusted equipment, glass beakers caked with a gray film, and strange, archaic electrical contraptions with thick ceramic insulators. But it was not the lab equipment that captured her attention. It was the centerpiece, a massive obsidian-like stone, roughly hewn, yet bearing intricate geometric carvings that pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible iridescence under her flashlight. It wasn't just a stone, it was a monolith, alien and utterly out of place in a university basement. This was it. This was Alastair Finch's discovery. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The journal spoke of this. He had called it the Dreamstone, a relic he believed capable of accessing forgotten consciousness, of bridging the gap between past and present. The carvings on its surface were identical to the cryptic symbols in Finch's journals, now clearly revealed as a complex circuit diagram. His ancient technology wasn't mechanical, but energetic, perhaps even metaphysical. But how did it work, and where was Finch himself? After weeks of fruitless official channels, Eleanor decided a more direct approach was necessary. She borrowed a set of master keys, a bold and frankly unprofessional move that went against every rule she swore by. The metallic clang of the old iron gate as it finally swung open echoed ominously in the silent corridor. The air that greeted her was not merely cold, but utterly stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying paper, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old electricity or rusted machinery. Her flashlight beam cut through the thick dust motes dancing in the air, revealing a narrow, descending staircase. Each step creaked under her weight, a prelude to a secret that had festered for nearly a century. What would you have done in her shoes, standing on the precipice of a forbidden truth, knowing the risks she was taking with her career, perhaps even her safety? If you've ever felt that pull of a mystery, that insatiable need to uncover what's hidden, then you understand the compulsion that drove Eleanor forward. The staircase opened into a vast, cavernous space, far larger than she had anticipated. It was indeed an old laboratory, but one frozen in time. Tables were laden with rusted equipment, glass beakers caked with a gray film, and strange, archaic electrical contraptions with thick ceramic insulators. But it was not the lab equipment that captured her attention. It was the centerpiece, a massive obsidian-like stone, roughly hewn, yet bearing intricate geometric carvings that pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible iridescence under her flashlight. It wasn't just a stone, it was a monolith, alien and utterly out of place in a university basement. This was it. This was Alastair Finch's discovery. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The journal spoke of this. He had called it the Dreamstone, a relic he believed capable of accessing forgotten consciousness, of bridging the gap between past and present. The carvings on its surface were identical to the cryptic symbols in Finch's journals, now clearly revealed as a complex circuit diagram. His ancient technology wasn't mechanical, but energetic, perhaps even metaphysical. But how did it work? And where was Finch himself?
A desk stood nearby, covered in dust, and on it a single bound ledger. This, she knew, would contain the final entries, the answers. She opened the ledger with trembling hands. Finch's handwriting, once meticulous, had grown erratic, sprawling across the pages, punctuated by desperate pleas and scientific observations that verged on madness. His final hours unfolded before her, not through some dramatic confrontation, but through a slow, terrifying descent into a discovery too profound, too dangerous to bear. He had successfully activated the monolith. He wrote of voices, of images, of a flood of information from an impossible antiquity. He described advanced civilizations, not just on Earth, but beyond, and their connection to humanity's earliest origins. It was knowledge that would rewrite not just history, but humanity's place in the cosmos. But the activation came with a terrible cost. The monolith, he discovered, wasn't just a receiver. It was a conduit, a drain. It began to consume him, not physically at first, but mentally, spiritually. He wrote of losing himself in the torrent of information, of his own mind fragmenting under the pressure of countless alien memories. His final entries were a frantic warning, a desperate plea to seal the knowledge away, to destroy the stone before it consumed everything. He wrote of the old ones, not as benevolent teachers, but as indifferent, immense intelligences whose understanding would shatter the human psyche. Then the narrative shifted. The entries abruptly changed tone, becoming more clinical, sterile. They were no longer in Finch's hand. Someone else had taken over the ledger. This second hand meticulously documented Finch's deterioration, his physical emaciation, the vacant stare in his eyes, his endless, whispered babbling in archaic tongues. The university, or a select few within it, had found him. They hadn't dismissed him as insane. They had understood the devastating implications of his discovery. The entries detailed a macabre experiment, attempting to extract the knowledge from him, to control the monolith, to weaponize or monetize the impossible truths he had stumbled upon.
They saw the potential power in the monolith, a power that could reshape geopolitics, science, and religion. But they also saw the danger, not just to establish dogma, but to their own control. Finch, a broken vessel, had become a liability. The final page detailed his accidental fall from a high laboratory platform, a fall witnessed by only one man, the head of the classics department, Professor Eldridge Thorne. Thorne, a man whose legacy Finch's discoveries would have utterly obliterated. Thorne, whose name Eleanor had seen scrawled on a memo ordering the immediate sealing of the sub-basement. The air in the long-abandoned lab grew heavy with the weight of that revealed death. Finch hadn't simply departed due to ill health. He had been silenced, murdered, to protect a fragile academic order and to suppress a truth too vast for the world to bear. The irony was chilling. The very institution dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge had committed a heinous act to bury it. His final hours were a protracted torment, a forced feeding of overwhelming knowledge, culminating in a cold, calculated disposal. Eleanor stood paralyzed, the ledger heavy in her hands. The secret wasn't just what was in the basement, but how a brilliant mind had been extinguished to keep it hidden. The monolith pulsed faintly, an ancient heart still beating, echoing the immense silent power it held. It felt like standing in the very chamber where a man's spirit had been devoured, then his body cast aside, all for the sake of institutional control and the preservation of comforting lies. She closed the ledger, the sound sharp in the oppressive quiet. This was not merely history, it was a crime scene, a cover-up stretching across generations. She understood now why Silas, the old janitor, spoke of unsettling drafts.
It wasn't air, it was the lingering despair of Alistair Finch, a ghost trapped not by chains, but by a buried truth. The structural instability wasn't in the building, but in the very edifice of human understanding. If stories like Alistair's, stories of forgotten truths and the cost of challenging the status quo, resonate with you, consider subscribing to How They Died. We uncover the hidden chapters of history, the lives lived and lost in the pursuit of something greater. The question now became, what was she to do with this terrible knowledge? To reveal it would shake Blackwood University to its core, undoubtedly ending her career and potentially inviting the same sinister forces that silenced Finch decades ago. To remain silent, however, would be to become complicit in the cover-up, to allow Alistair Finch's sacrifice to be in vain. The monolith hummed, a silent judge, its ancient carvings seeming to mock the petty human dramas playing out above ground. She knew she couldn't simply walk away. Finch's last desperate entries were not just a warning, but an implicit plea for someone to learn the truth, to keep the knowledge from falling into the wrong hands, or perhaps simply to acknowledge his existence and his immense, terrifying discovery. The legacy of Alistair Finch was not merely his tragic end, but the burden of the truth he left behind. The university had tried to erase him, to make his life and death vanish into the academic ether, but the journals, the map, and eventually the very presence of the monolith refused to let him be forgotten. The immediate aftermath of Eleanor's discovery was a maelstrom of fear and resolve. She painstakingly photographed every page of the ledger, every detail of the monolith, every piece of forgotten equipment. She knew that simply presenting her findings wouldn't be enough. The university had protected its secrets for too long. She needed a plan, allies, or at least a way to ensure that if anything happened to her, the truth would still come out. She started leaving anonymous tips to investigative journalists, carefully couching her information in terms that would intrigue rather than overwhelm. The impact of Finch's unburied secret, even before it fully emerged into public consciousness, rippled through the university. Whispers began, hushed conversations among professors about long-ago rumors. the peculiar circumstances of Professor Thorne's later career, a meteoric rise followed by a sudden, scandal-free retirement to a lavish estate. The very air of the classics department seemed to shift, heavy with unspoken histories. Eleanor, though outwardly calm, felt a constant surveillance, a cold weight on her shoulders, as if the guardians of the old order sensed her actions, her quiet rebellion. Eleanor percebia a mudança não em grandes gestos, mas nos olhares que se desviavam rápido demais, nos silêncios repentinos quando ela entrava numa sala, na forma como o zelador demorava um segundo a mais para liberar a porta do corredor proibido. Não era paranoia, era uma dança sutil de poder e intimidação. A cada dia, a universidade parecia encolher ao redor dela, os corredores outrora vibrantes, agora sussurrantes, as bibliotecas cheias de segredos não lidos. Eleanor sentia o peso de um gigante adormecido começando a acordar, e ela, uma pequena bolha na superfície, era a causa. Os jornais de Finch eram um mapa para um abismo, e a cada linha decifrada, ela via não apenas a obsessão de um homem, mas a verdade por trás da pedra. O monolito não era apenas um artefato, era uma espécie de bateria, um acumulador de algo? Energia, consciência, memória? Finch nunca chegou a uma conclusão, mas suas últimas anotações eram aterrorizantes, falando de uma pulsação ressonante que se alinhava com certas fases lunares, um despertar lento que ele temia mais do que a própria morte. Ele havia morrido tentando conter algo que ele mesmo tinha ativado.
E agora, Eleanor estava pisando nos mesmos rastros, sentindo o mesmo frio na espinha. A jornalista, uma veterana chamada Sofia Mendes, atendeu a primeira dica com ceticismo profissional. Manuscritos secretos e um monólito num porão de universidade? Ela zombou para seu editor. Parece mais roteiro de filme B do que reportagem. Mas algo na persistência anônima dos e-mails, na riqueza dos detalhes técnicos que uma suposta teoria da conspiração não teria, a fisgou. As fotografias desfocadas, mas sugestivas do diário de Finch e de uma rocha estranhamente lisa, com inscrições que pareciam pulsar sob a lente, eram o suficientes para Sofia acender a faísca da curiosidade. Ela começou a cavar, sutilmente, sem levantar suspeitas. Ligou para antigos colegas de Finch, para os poucos que ainda estavam vivos e dispostos a falar, e encontrou uma parede de silêncio e medo que só atiçou sua determinação. A universidade, claro, não estava inativa. O professor Thorne, que Eleanor havia descoberto ser o principal responsável por varrer o caso Finch anos atrás, reapareceu nos corredores, um fantasma bem vestido do passado. Seus olhos, antes descritos como gentis, agora carregavam um brilho metálico, um conhecimento pesado e implacável. Ele se aproximou de Eleanor no refeitório, com uma xícara de café fumegante. Professor Vance, ele disse, com uma voz suave que mal escondia o aço. O passado é um monstro faminto. É mais seguro deixá-lo dormir. Não era uma ameaça, era uma constatação de quem já havia visto o que o monstro podia fazer. A conversa durou menos de 5 minutos, mas o cheiro de café amargo e a sensação de estar sob um microscópio ficaram com ela o dia todo. Eleanor sentiu o nó na garganta, a urgência de que não podia parar agora, não depois de ter visto o que viu. Ela havia cruzado um ponto de não retorno. Se parasse, Finch teria morrido em vão e a verdade ficaria enterrada para sempre, talvez com consequências muito maiores do que seu próprio destino. O que você faria se encontrasse uma verdade tão monumental e perigosa, sabendo que as forças que a mantiveram oculta fariam de tudo para que ela permanecesse assim? Pense sobre isso por um momento. As noites de Eleanor viraram uma maratona de estudo e planejamento. Ela aprofundou a busca por informações sobre Thorne e seu estranho patrocínio após a morte de Finch. Descobriu doações anônimas maciças para o departamento de clássicos, sempre atreladas a cláusulas de sigilo e a manutenção de certas áreas do campus como intocáveis.
O dinheiro fluía de fundações obscuras, sem rastros claros, tecendo uma rede complexa de proteção em torno do segredo. Thor não estava apenas limpando a bagunça, ele era parte integrante de uma estrutura que se beneficiava ou pelo menos protegia o que quer que estivesse naquele porão. Ela começou a sentir que não estava sozinha na perseguição. Um dia, ao voltar para seu apartamento, encontrou a porta ligeiramente entreaberta. Nada parecia fora do lugar, mas a sensação de que mãos invisíveis haviam tateado seus pertences era inconfundível, um arrepio na espinha que gelava até os ossos. Alguém estava avisando-a, testando os limites, deixando claro que seus passos estavam sendo observados. O jogo havia escalado de sussurros a toques mais diretos, mais invasivos. A urgência de Sofia Mendes também cresceu. Seus contatos, sempre tão dispostos a fofocar sobre escândalos menores, tornaram-se herméticos quando o nome de Finch era mencionado. Uma bibliotecária aposentada que havia trabalhado com Finch por décadas recusou-se a falar, mas deixou uma única palavra escapulir antes de desligar o telefone. Ecos. Ecos de quê? De uma história que se repetia? A verdade sobre Alistair Finch estava emaranhada em algo maior, algo que ia além de um simples caso de pesquisa acadêmica mal-sucedida. Era um ciclo. Se você está sentindo o mesmo arrepio que Eleanor e Sofia, essa sensação de que há muito mais por trás das cortinas, deixe um like no vídeo.
Isso ajuda a mostrar que histórias como esta merecem ser desenterradas. Eleanor sabia que seu tempo estava acabando. A universidade não aprenderia, não a faria desaparecer, não em pleno século XXI. Mas poderia destruí-la academicamente, desacreditá-la, transformá-la numa pária. E pior, eles poderiam remover o monólito, apagando a última evidência física do legado de Finch. Ela precisava de um plano que não dependesse apenas de dicas anônimas. Precisava de algo estrondoso, inegável. A próxima fase seria mais arriscada, exigiria uma exposição que ela não estava preparada. A verdade no porão não queria ser ignorada, e o silêncio da universidade era apenas o prelúdio de um grito. His final hours, though meticulously recorded by his captors, were ultimately an act of sacrifice. Alistair Finch, in his maddening pursuit of truth, had stumbled upon something so fundamentally paradigm-shattering that it broke him. He may have died a desperate, manipulated figure, but his spirit, his relentless curiosity, lived on in the very secrets he sought to protect. His death was not the end of a life, but the beginning of a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down to all who prioritize comfort and control over the unsettling, transformative power of truth. The university had wanted him forgotten, mas in death, Alistair Finch found an unlikely champion, a successor who understood that some secrets are simply too immense, too vital to remain buried. The story of Alistair Finch became a testament to the idea that knowledge, once unearthed, possesses its own immutable will to survive. It can be suppressed, twisted, or violently guarded, but its inherent nature is to resist enclosure, to seep through cracks, and eventually to burst forth. Eleanor Vance, driven by the echoes of Finch's final struggle, would spend years ensegurando que a academia-estabelecimento poderia nunca mais tão facilmente extinguir uma borbulhante verdade. A Universidade Basement não era mais um forgotten space. Ele passou a ser um túmulo, um monumento e um constante, silencioso alerta. Reminds us that beneath the polished veneer of institutions, powerful and often dangerous truths lie waiting, preserved not by design, but pela sheer, unyielding force the story itself. If this deep dive into forgotten histories and the fight for truth captivated you, leave a like to tell us what other mysteries you want unearthed.